people online, we want you to hear this too, so I'll use the microphone. The Reverend Joseph Ellwanger comes to us today by the enthusiastic recommendation of Mark Hilgendorf. Raise your hand. Mark is one of our fellow parishioners. Pastor Joe met a few months ago with students in one of Mark's courses, and Mark and his students were thrilled to hear some of Pastor Joe's experiences and lessons from his civil rights activities. Thank you, Mark. We have invited one of Pastor Joe's fellow pastors and a very good friend to facilitate this morning's interview, the Reverend Richard Deines. In recent years, Pastor Rick helped establish the Habitat for Humanity, the Frank Zeidler Center for Public Discussion, and Serenity Inns to provide opportunities for recovery for addicted men. Thank you, Pastor Rick, for being here. Pastor Rick will have a few questions to launch the interview process. About halfway through, you'll be invited to raise your questions as well. Copies of an article about Pastor Ellwanger will be available on the table in the back, and copies of Pastor Ellwanger's book is available for $20. All right.
Thanks, Bob. Bob and I go back to Portugal for a few days there with he and his wife Sonia, and the Deals, where we were part of a small community outside of Portugal, a rural communal experiment. So Bob, you and I and Sonia got to engage a bit there, and then I was part of Bob's community transformation project, which went on for a number of years here in Milwaukee and became really the base for the Zeidler Group being able to expand the way we did over the years. I was here with the Zeidler Group for 3 discussions on race. I don't know if any of you were here during that time, but we had 3 consecutive over a 3-week period, I think, and so I was impressed with this congregation and your commitment, and that's part of the joy of being here, along with just what I'll say in a minute about my connection with Joe. I call him Joe, but if you go out in Milwaukee anywhere and you say Pastor Joe, the whole neighborhood will stand up and cheer. He's got that kind of recognition in this city and in these neighborhoods, and that goes back for me to 1982 when I came to Milwaukee from Kansas City to help develop the Lutheran urban ministry here in Milwaukee, and that's out of which Habitat and Serenity Inns and all this stuff came out. But Joe and I walked together through that often, and I think maybe my first real awareness of Joe and Joyce and Cross Lutheran Church down 15th and Walnut, and Joe, I hope you'll share a bit of that history as well, coming out of your work in Alabama. But they were also, at that time, I was not aware of the word accompaniment, walking with, understanding and learning from. I would say if there's one thing that Joe has taught Milwaukee and the churches in Milwaukee and way beyond that through Micah and other groups, is the authenticity of the word of life is to be able to accompany people, not just talk about them, not just describe them, not just complain about them, but walk with them, whomever they are, wherever they are, whatever their circumstances. If that's not an embodiment of love thy neighbor, I don't know what it is. For me, that's Joe. My call, to use the religious term, to Milwaukee was to help the congregations in Milwaukee, at that time called LCA, then ELCA. Joe came out of something called ELC. We were really an alphabet soup kind of bunch of Lutherans in this city. So one of the things that grew over the years was that we bonded across these divisions simply because we wanted what was best for the city of Milwaukee as the church. I just think this congregation, my feel for you guys is that you've got that heart. So part of me here is to both thank you for being who you are, but also for the opportunity to getting to know you a little bit. Because I don't know, I think congregations are few and far between that are doing the kind of outreach and connecting you're doing. And I don't know about you, but as I've thought about this preparation and direction, I thought how important context is. So when Joe talks about civil rights, Alabama and the South is a context. One has to, and yet that's not his only context. 1967 to Milwaukee?
Right.
That's a different context, informed by the earlier one, but then it was different. And then 1981, too, when I came, it shifted again because we were kind of saying, how do we do this together in this city, not just as independent congregations across the city? I came thinking I knew what urban ministry was about because I'd done Chicago, I'd done Kansas City, I'd done Los Angeles, I'd done a bit in Philadelphia. Here I was supposed to provide some example. I got here and looked around, went over to Cross Church, looked around, got to, there was the example. So I'm introducing Joe today as one who's given me a picture of what it means to be the church in this place. And I appreciate your friendship and your support, Joe. So this is Pastor Joe.
All right. And I usually have my wife as the timekeeper, but she's not here today, so somebody's going to have to watch me because, as you can see, pastors have a tendency to go on. But it's a pleasure to be here, pleasure to worship here this morning, and to find that you do indeed live up to your claim out there that you're a lively, spirit-filled congregation, and to see the different generations, and to have a few children, and the context today is encouraging as well, and challenging as well. And I certainly don't want to present my experience in Birmingham, Alabama, and Selma, Alabama, as if this is a kind of interesting story of the past. We better connect it with the present today, or I have missed the mark. But let me just say a couple of things and then tell a story, because I think stories are remembered, and maybe even the children will appreciate a story. But I truly appreciate the fact that I am not exactly from a traditional background as a Lutheran pastor. My father was a pastor, and I owe a lot to him, but he was not a traditional pastor either. I grew up in a storefront church in St. Louis, Missouri, back in the Depression days, up to the 7th grade, and then for a year in southern Indiana in a rural parish, and then from 1945 on VJ Day, we moved to Selma, Alabama, where my father became the president of Alabama Lutheran Academy and College, which was an African-American high school and junior college, serving especially the 33 Lutheran congregations in central Alabama and southern Alabama. And it was a way of giving the young people who came through the schools that were connected with almost all of those churches, not only a grade school beginning, but a high school beginning. And if they wanted to go on and teach in those schools, they went on to the junior college. That was my father. That's how I got to Selma, Alabama. And that was during the Jim Crow days. 1958, I was installed in St. Paul Lutheran Church, African-American congregation in Birmingham, Alabama. And from 58 to 67, I was there. I say often that I truly am appreciative of the fact that my first call was not to Bismarck, North Dakota, and to, or maybe it's South Dakota, but to a traditional congregation with stained glass windows, nothing against your stained glass windows, and a pipe organ, nothing against your pipe organ. But I am grateful that I was called to an African American congregation in 1958 and up through 67. And you know, those are the civil rights days and the days that Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference were very much in the news and in the forefront of challenging, first of all, the church, and then our nation to live up to its constitution, to say nothing of calling the church to live up to its calling to remove the barriers and to build the bridges instead of supporting legal white supremacist segregation as it was in the South especially. And you know, the rest has been history, because going to school in a white junior high school and senior high school in Selma, Alabama in the Jim Crow days really showed me what Jim Crow was all about. You know, white Southerners in those days said that, well, whites and blacks really enjoy this arrangement. We all agree that we get along together, and this is the way we live together and recognize each other's humanity. Well, of course, nothing could be further from the truth. And it was the civil rights movement that challenged this false rationalization that white folks in the South had, and most of them actually believed that blacks and whites preferred to be separate, preferred to have this kind of a Jim Crow existence. And Dr. King, of course, made it very clear that was not the case, that blacks never appreciated slavery and never appreciated Jim Crow. But the white South, and the country for that matter, had difficulty seeing that and believing it, and seeing that Dr. King was a real prophet. And like all prophets, he got plenty of hostile approaches, and he lived literally under threats every day of his ministry after the Montgomery bus boycott, 1955-56. But I need to tell the story here for you to get a feel for those days, and then we'll do some connecting links here to the present. This is a story from my parish experience in Birmingham, 1961. So that's in the middle of those civil rights years. And it's a story that really has meant much to me all the way to the present in terms of my ministry. I've got it in my book at the beginning and at the end, and it was not a mistake or a lapse of memory. I have it there twice because I consider it that important. It was 1961. I was pastor of an African American congregation in Birmingham, and we got an invitation from the Lutheran parish in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, which is about 60 miles southwest of Birmingham, from a white congregation inviting our youth, all of whom are black, to join their youth, all of whom were white, for a Sunday evening fellowship. Now that sounds like an interesting evening, but it was far more than just an interesting evening invitation. It was an out-of-the-box invitation for the white congregation to invite our youth. It was an out-of-the-box decision for any of our youth to decide to go. Because you see, in 1961, African American youth and white youth in the South never were in an experience where they were equals. They didn't go to basketball games together. They didn't go to McDonald's together. They didn't go to church together. Never. So when I brought the invitation to our youth, I asked them, would any of you like to go with me on a Sunday evening to this? And I had to tell them it was a white congregation. And there were two 15-year-old girls, Betty Wells and Carolyn Freeman, who said, yes, we'd like to go. So checked with their parents, definitely needed their permission, and we went. We had a great evening, had a spaghetti dinner, and the youth shared with each other their experiences in school and home, and discovered that they weren't as different as they thought they were across the racial lines. And they had prayer and had some singing. It was just a good fellowship that evening. We went home. I remember that Carolyn and Betty in the back seat were saying, you know, this is what the church should be doing more of. She was waxing, or they were waxing theologically, that the church ought to be building bridges and not building walls. Well, on Tuesday, after this Sunday evening, I picked up the Birmingham paper off the front porch, and there on the front page was the picture of the intern pastor who had invited us from Tuscaloosa, and the story of how the Ku Klux Klan, the night before, had come to the church, had abducted this intern pastor, taken him out to the edge of town, beaten him, left him to walk back on the railroad tracks at 2 o'clock in the morning, a cross burned in the church yard, and a note on the church door that said, if another integrated youth meeting happens here, something worse will happen next. I hadn't finished reading the article in the paper when the phone rang. And the voice on the other end very gruffly said, is this the Reverend? I said, yes, it is. And he said, well, you and the two girls are next. Click. Well, I knew that after just seeing what happened in Tuscaloosa, that this was not an idle threat, and so I needed to talk to them and to their parents. And I'm getting to the climax of this story. I remember the conversation with Carolyn Freeman. I told her about the threat, and I asked her, are you afraid, Carolyn? And now remember, this is a 15-year-old girl. And she said, no, I'm not so much afraid as I am ashamed. I said, Carolyn, what do you mean you're ashamed? And she said, well, others have done so much and are doing so much for the freedom of my people and all people, and I have done so little. as you can see, that story still is unforgettable. And it helps all of us and me to see what was happening then, and there's a connection with the now. For one thing, it makes it very clear that the segregated system of the South, the Jim Crow system, was built on hatred. That's sheer hatred. To take a pastor out, beat him, and have him walk back at 2 o'clock in the morning. And then threaten the congregation, if they ever do it again, something worse will happen. And more importantly, it tells us the spirit in the African American community at the time. Here's a 15-year-old girl who has a sense of standing on the shoulders of those who have gone before her and that are around her now. She had caught the geist, the spirit of the times, which was, we will get our freedom. And when you sense the deep faith that this 15-year-old girl had in 1961, at a time when indeed I would guess that the majority of blacks themselves wondered if Jim Crow would ever be a thing of the past. And it's a reminder of how that faith is so real, and it, I hope, will help you to understand that the song, which we often sing on historic occasions, maybe even in service once in a while, it's in our new ELCA hymnal, "We Shall Overcome." Think about this for a moment. 1961, and in 1963, when the demonstrations at Birmingham were taking place, every night a mass meeting, and we always ended with the singing of "We Shall Overcome," grabbing arms like this so that we had to be next to each other as we sang it, and to sing day after day, "We shall overcome," against the forces of the Ku Klux Klan that hovered in the shadows around almost every town and city in the South particularly. That took faith. And that is why Dr. King and his associates had it took a deep faith for them to believe that Jim Crow would ever be defeated. Fast forward to the present. January 6th, 2020, and what did we see? Ku Klux Klan, Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, attacking our Capitol with cross, Confederate flag, and all of the hoopla of the past. Right here, 2020. And we feel it in our bones now after the election of 2024. And it's a story like this that on the one hand can scare folks, sort of fits in with the pericope today. There's certainly plenty around us that can cause us to be shaking and wondering and uncertain about a whole lot of things. But it's the story of Carolyn Freeman and the civil rights period that reminds us of the faith of the people. And with that faith, amazing things can happen. Nobody would have predicted that this strong Voting Rights Act that changed things in 1965 would ever be passed. I'm about to wind up here before we have time for questions, but I did participate in the demonstrations in Selma for a strong Voting Rights Act. More details in chapter 8 of my book, but when you stop to think about it, I think most people know about Bloody Sunday, March 7th, 1965. 500 men, women, and children march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And think about this for a moment. What in the world were they about on this Sunday afternoon? Martin Luther King, who was in Atlanta that Sunday at his Ebenezer Baptist Church, where his father was pastor, and he had advised the SCLC staff in Selma not to march on that Sunday afternoon because, after all, they were waiting for a decision from the federal judge in Montgomery to okay the march from Selma to Montgomery, which is what they were going to begin that day, they said. But Martin Luther King wanted approval for that march so that they could get some federal protection for the marchers, because 50 miles from Selma to Montgomery goes through some pretty forsaken territory if you've ever traveled Highway 80 between Selma and Montgomery. So there was all kinds of forces suggesting not to march on March 7th. And yet they went. And here's the story that I think really shares and sheds so much light on the forces at work in those days. If you think about it, they did not know whether they were going to make it to the other side of the bridge, because they had heard that George Wallace, the governor, had said, this march from Selma to Montgomery will happen over my dead body. Those were his very words. And so they knew that they were going to probably meet some forces on the bridge or on the other side. They didn't know whether they would get to the other side of the bridge. And if they did, they didn't know whether they would make it to Montgomery. And if they made it to Montgomery, they did not know whether this would convince the Congress, as sluggish as Congress always has been, to pass a strong Voting Rights Act. And if the Congress passed a strong Voting Rights Act, they didn't know whether black folks would vote with the Ku Klux Klan hovering around every town in the South. They're going to go vote, even with a Voting Rights Act that says you have the right to vote. And if they did vote, would it change anything? Or would life be the same afterward as it had been before? And yet, they marched. That's a faith much deeper than even they realized that they had. And the miracle of the story is that not that day, but 2 weeks later, the march to Montgomery happened. And by the grace of God, I was there at the end and the last stage of that. And Bloody Sunday and the Selma and Montgomery March pricked the conscience of our nation and of Congress to the point that the Congress passed the strongest Voting Rights Act that has ever been passed in this country. It was so strong that if anybody in Wilcox County, where no African American had been permitted to vote, not even the high school principals or the pastors, if one person in Wilcox County reported to Washington that I have had difficulty in registering or voting, Washington would send a marshal to enforce it. That's how strong the Voting Rights Act was. And the amazing thing is that when that was passed, with all of the forces breathing down their necks to scare the living daylights out of them, blacks voted by the thousands. And the ultimate miracle is that things changed. Within 2 years, the Jim Crow forced legal segregation collapsed because even white folks running for office realized they had to get some of the black vote or the other person who might be white is going to win. And so they began listening to blacks. And they actually dropped the segregation laws. You can go to Selma, Alabama today, and there's going to be a 60th anniversary of the Bloody Sunday, March 7th, 8th, and 9th, coming up in 2025. You can go remember that day, and you can go into any restaurant with a racially mixed group. You will probably find a racially mixed serving crew, and that is the miracle of Selma and the Voting Rights Act, and why I say, I'm going to wrap up here, why I say that today, without a question, voting is, as John Lewis said, the most powerful nonviolent tool that we have to make a change in our communities and in our country. And we have to name voter suppression for what it is. You know, there are those forces today that say, and this is bringing it up to today, those forces that say, oh, we have to make it a little more difficult to vote because we have to root out all of the voter fraud. Let me say that those are all false attempts to make it more difficult for people to vote, to scare people from voting, and we have to oppose all of the voter suppression efforts of today. Not simply as good citizens of this city and this country, but as Christians, because voting is in fact the way we truly love our neighbor, and we say we care about the policies and the people who make the policies over you and your children. And we have to say that to our congregations to make it clear that voting is important. All right, I will finish here, and so much more in between this couple stories that I told here, but I hope we do have some time for questions.
Go ahead, sure.
I'll repeat it here.
Wait, I've got it, Mark.
Hello? Okay. Your talk is just so inspiring, and I think we all agree. So many people were courageous and fearless. But a few weeks ago, 1 out of 4 black men voted for Donald Trump. 20% of the black community, maybe 30% in Milwaukee, did not vote. If all of those African American citizens had voted for Kamala, she might be president. And you described, Mr. Trump, earlier, the black community supported him, the Hispanic community. 1 out of 3 Hispanic men voted for Donald Trump. It is so sobering to me that the Kings and the John Lewises gave their lives for a situation. I don't know what those 2 men, if they knew these results now, what would they think?
All right. You're correct with your facts. And this is simply a reminder that the demonic forces at work in our culture are real. When you think about the lies, the conspiracy theories that have been talked about and PhDs buy them and believe them, it's no wonder that some folks, some black folks, and it was not the majority, but some black folks and some brown folks voted for Trump, who promised all kinds of things, that I am going to bring down inflation and I'm going to bring down the price of eggs and bread and all that. And, you know, people who were scuffling for the ability to survive will grasp at straws. And it is sad, and you're absolutely right. If the African community, American communities around the country had voted 95% for Kamala, she would undoubtedly be the coming president. But let me just say that Dr. King, in his speech at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March, which I consider his greatest speech, said, as he posed the rhetorical question, how long is it going to be before we have some equality and we have some freedom that we really are or have been marching for? Not long, he said, because, and he gives about 6 or 7 short phrases. 2 of them are these: no lie can live forever, and truth crushed to earth will rise again. And this is where today's gospel lesson and the sermon was right on target. That when these times where the demonic forces in our culture seem to be winning the day, and believe me, there have been a lot of times in our history as a nation that these lies have lived, you know, that slavery is okay, and that after all, the white civilization has surpassed all the other civilizations of the world, so that's why we have to keep white folks in power. Those are times when we have to see what we as God's people can do to serve those who are at the edges and to speak the truth to power and to live lives that live the truth. So we've got a lot of work to do. It's a reminder of the times in which we live.
Yes, as someone who grew up in the Trinity Lutheran Church in Bismarck, North Dakota, and graduated from Concordia College, my comment is, we never heard much about civil rights in church. This is in the 50s. So I'm glad to hear that the Lutheran Church was actually actively doing something. There were people who stood up and said, no more of this. And that leads me to the question, have you kept in touch with Carolyn, and what is she doing now?
All right, I'll get to that question in a moment, but I have to back up to your first comments about the Lutheran churches in the country. Typically, I don't know about the Episcopal churches, but typically did not even mention the civil rights movement, much less suggest that as Christians we should be on the side of justice and we ought to be fighting segregation. And I would not be able to tell you that the Lutheran Church at that time in the South was taking the right position. I was opposed by my the equivalent of a bishop. I was Missouri Synod, and so was the president of the Southern District, who sent a telegram to the sheriff in Dallas County when I led the concerned white citizens of Alabama in March in Selma in solidarity with the voting rights movement. He sent a telegram that said the Reverend Joseph Ellwanger does not represent the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod and his actions here today. And so the Lutheran Church was pretty silent, and so were most of the churches. Unfortunately, they did not see the movement for justice and Dr. King as a prophet at all at that time. As a matter of fact, there were billboards in the South particularly that claimed that Dr. King was a communist and he must be opposed. Anyway, you asked about Carolyn Freeman. Yes, I did meet Carolyn Freeman. Years after this event, she moved to Philadelphia, became a social worker, no surprise, and then retired and came back with her husband to Columbus, Georgia. And it so happened that my wife and I went to demonstrations against the School of the Americas there in Columbus. That's a whole other issue. But going to Columbus, Georgia, and I discovered that she was there in her retirement. We had an evening meal with her and her husband. So I asked her about this moment back in 1961. And would you believe that she said, did I really say that? This is in line with what Jesus said in Matthew 25, when the folks who fed the hungry and visited the sick and those in prison are commended by Jesus. They say, when did we do all this for you? In other words, it was done so humbly and so authentically that it was nothing that she boasted about or even remembered. But her work in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, as a social worker was the way in which she lived out her calling, her gospel calling, which was to serve people who are in trouble. And she did it, and she did it all through her career until she retired. So, all right, we're probably toward the end of. I'm willing to stay, but I don't want to overstep the time here. Okay.
We Episcopalians are not of one voice in terms of voting. We have people who vote all over and believe that they are indeed, we all are following God's mandate to love one another. And in light of the diversity that we acknowledge and embrace here at Christ Church, this is a place for everyone. And of course, you know, as a pastor, you agree with that. As Christians, we are to love one another. We don't have to agree with each other. We love one another. How do you see here in Milwaukee us proceeding in light of the mandate for the election? You know, it's clear. So instead of looking back, and let's look forward and see how justice might be lived out by all of us here in Milwaukee in light of this election that told us about each other, and we love each other. And so how do we proceed in unity as Christians in light of our polarity and diversity in voting?
And after this, there's one more question. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, you raise a very interesting and complex and important question. In fact, it's a kind of follow-up to the sermon this morning. You know, I'm grateful that is it Reverend Matthew that was preaching right here. Yes, thank you. You know, made it very clear, connecting Christ Church Episcopal with such things as Sojourner Truth, certain I call it a ministry there on 6th and Walnut, and connecting with is it All People's Lutheran Church that you're talking about? All right. Great, but you notice that the important push is to walk with, accompany the folks who are living a different reality than we are here, that you all are here. My wife and I have made it a point to continue to live at 16th and Walnut, and in my retirement, I am a pastor, a volunteer assisting minister. I'm not functioning as a pastor anymore as such, at Hefferthal Lutheran Church, 18th and Locust. That's a very personal decision. I'm not expecting everybody to do that. But it's my way of making the connection that keeps me honest and reminds me every day as Tavares comes to the door, rings the bell and asks for food, the young man with mental health issues whom I baptized 30 years ago. But it keeps me in touch with the reality that others are living. And that is exactly the service, the connections with those who are experiencing the real difficulties and struggles of the injustices that exist, because you see, racism is not just a personal matter, it's a systemic matter. There are the systems that remain in place so that people in poverty, and that includes some white folks, but especially black and brown, black and especially, it keeps people in poverty. And so we need to, at a time such as this, today's gospel lesson is pretty graphic, and it's on target. And we say, wait a minute, we're living in end times. Yeah, we are. But end times always call us to show what Christians are supposed to be noted for. A love that risks and a love that identifies with the hurting and a love that serves the suffering, as in fact Jesus himself showed the way to do and to be. Okay.
One question here, and then there is one more.
Well, the good news is I don't have to ask my question because Mary Traynor took care of it much more nicely than I probably would have been able to. So I just want to, I'm very involved in outreach here, and I do want to point out that, as Mary said, we're not of one mind. We're a very diverse group. Some of the most dedicated outreach work that's being done by this church is done by people of different political minds. And I think we have to be very careful not to assume, not to castigate, and to listen. And that's enough to say, probably.
All right, and we need to talk across those divides that happen in congregations. No question about that. Although I can tell you that we're pretty much of one mind at Hephatha Church. But anyway, one thing that I have not touched on at all, but really is part of the answer about, okay, how do we respond to these end times now? Serving those at the edges is part of it. Another part is speaking truth to power, and that's hard for a split or divided congregation to do, but there is an organization called MICA, Milwaukee Inner City Congregations Allied for Hope, that consists of Hephatha Church, Cross Lutheran Church, a couple of Catholic churches, Baptist churches, and a couple of synagogues and so on. And we work at getting at the injustice issues and the systemic stuff that remains generation after generation. Especially, we work at prison reform. We have 23,000 in our Wisconsin correctional system, and I'm about to get off on something that I don't have time for this afternoon, this morning, but what I am saying is that congregations can, in fact, link arms with other congregations in doing the difficult and the nitty-gritty work of justice. And if congregations are so divided that they can't join as congregations, individuals certainly can join. We have a transformational justice task force, for instance. We have a health equity task force in MICA. And these are task forces that get at some of these nitty-gritty issues that try to move the needle, as Dr. King said. The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And as Obama said, we need to be the people who help bend the arc toward justice. And if congregations can't do it, then individuals can help do that. And that's part of responding to the injustices and, well, downright lies that are ruling the day and the moment.
This is so fascinating. We have just time for one more question. And I do want to mention that Pastor Joe has books on sale back there. last question coming up.
And this is, I think, sort of related to what you have just been talking about, but can you talk a little bit about the role of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in the time period, the civil rights time period in the 60s, and then what they're doing today? You know, how is it morphed to today? I know it's kind of a big question, but yeah.
Well, no, and it's a very interesting and important question. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference did not exist before 1956. It was the Montgomery bus boycott in 55 to 56. Think of this for a moment. The 95% of the African American population in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to take the bus and walked to school and to work, picked each other up, but for a year, they struggled just to get the seating restrictions moved. This sounds like a piddling little thing to work so hard for, but think about it. It has to do with personal sense of worth and value and dignity. And it is an injustice for Rosa Parks to be told to move from her seat to go further back because there are more white people now moving onto the bus and they need this seat. Anyway, it was 55, 56 that, and of course Dr. King turned out to be the leader almost by accident. Talk about God's hand in the civil rights movement and the whole period. It's amazing. Dr. King just came to Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. He was the young guy on the block, and I think that the black pastors who had been around for some time weren't sure whether they wanted this person or that person, so they'll take the young guy and say, you do it. And so almost by accident, but by God's plan, Martin Luther King turned out to be the leader and vaulted to prominence throughout the country as an amazing orator, but more importantly, a leader that believed that change is possible. And the Montgomery bus boycott, when it finally ended up in success, was the event that showed the black community we don't have to live in silence. We can bring about change nonviolently, and the result is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was born. And who were the leaders in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference? They were almost all clergy. That's why we can say that the Southern Christian, notice they even put it in their name, Leadership Conference, was led by pastors with, I called it congregation-based organizing in its first stage. Micah is an example of something years later. But the Southern Christian Leadership Conference then, of course, moved from Montgomery to some demonstrations in St. Augustine, Florida, to Albany, Georgia. And finally, the two demonstrations that really showed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to have not only a savvy or a boldness that we can change things, but a savvy. The demonstrations in Birmingham in 1963 brought about a 1964 civil rights law. It didn't change much of anything because of what I described before, white sheriffs and white DAs and white judges and the Ku Klux Klan in the shadows of every town and city in the South. But then the demonstrations in Selma in '65, bringing about this strong Voting Rights Act. Clearly, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference had the stamina, the boldness, the rootedness in the Lord will see us through, we shall overcome, and so they continued. But after Dr. King's death and assassination, they lost some of their steam and their leadership, and so all kinds of groups and organizations emerged, and Southern Christian Leadership Conference still has a nominal presence, but I was a member of it for many years, and I don't even get calls for contributions, so I'm not really up to speed on where it is right now. And I need to find out. You raise a good question. But we now have many other organizations that have picked up the mantle and are definitely working for change. And one of the campaigns, I have to mention this, one of the campaigns that Micah has waged in the last 2 years is the We All Belong campaign. And this is where we have had a couple of big press conferences and have openly said that the white Christian, in quotation marks, nationalism is a false ideology that is contrary to Christian teaching and Christian principles. But this is a movement that has sucked up a lot of evangelical churches and, sad to say, even a handful of black churches and Latino churches. And definitely, we have to look at our local communities to see the organizations that are standing up for justice and standing up to build the beloved community. The theme of our We All Belong campaign is we are determined to protect democracy. Democracy in its best and clearest understanding is everybody counts. Everyone's voice matters. Everyone's vote matters. That's what Christians have been saying for 2,000 years. So how can we go wrong on that? And for white Christian, in quotation marks, nationalists who say that we really have to bring back whites as in charge and must continue to make it difficult for people who are calling for justice changes and so on, push them to the edges. They need to be opposed. So we resist white Christian nationalism, and positively, we stand for building the beloved community, which is what Dr. King talked about as the community that includes everybody, including Muslims, Jews, blacks, whites, LGBTQIA, everybody. After all, we're all created in the image of God. That's what we believe. And that means, therefore, that everyone, as the Quakers say, has the spark of God in them, and everyone's voice matters. So SCLC may be somewhat defunct. I think they're still operating in a couple of locales, but there are plenty of opportunities to really stand for what SCLC stood for and risked for years for the truth and for love and for every life mattering. Anyway, thanks for some good questions.
Could we also have a round of applause for Pastor Rick, who said the introduction? Thank you most heartily. We feel that we have learned so much from you, and we feel your presence. Thank you.
The pleasure and blessings on Christ Church Episcopal. I am grateful that you could actually call a character like me to be a pastor here, and vice versa. We have an agreement now, Episcopals and ELCA and Presbyterian USA and so on, that clergy can be shared without any kind of penalty. And in fact, embraced as pastors. So anyway, it's good to be with you, and blessings. Thank
Folks in
you.
the